I am 66 years old now, and for 40 years I kept the biggest secret imaginable. On a damp morning in August of 1984, in a ridge of firs outside the tiny town of Cedar Hollow, I found something that was not supposed to exist. I called him Hank because he looked like a man who remembered the wind and the long quiet of the woods. I was 30 when I carried him back to the broken-down barn behind my house and decided, without really weighing anything, to hide him and to protect him. I am Tom Mercer. I am a carpenter by trade. I fix porches and make kitchen cabinets. I have the smell of sawdust in my clothes and the habit of waking at dawn with the radio on low. That ordinary life became a cover, a rhythm that held a secret like a hand against a beating heart. This is the story of how I found a creature everyone later labeled Bigfoot, how I sheltered him for 4 decades, the small habitual things that kept him alive, the people I pulled into a web of trust, and why, when the federal agents finally came, their reaction was the last thing I expected. You will hear about cold nights when the barn smelled of wet fur and boiled oats, about the sound of his breathing like a slow tide, about a carved wooden token I kept in my pocket like a promise. You will hear about the fear of being discovered and the quiet decisions that felt like love. You will hear why I decided, after 40 years, that it was time to let the world know. I grew up 2 miles from where I live now, in a small house my father built with his own hands in 1958. As a boy, I learned to measure boards by eye and to listen for the click of a settling roof at dusk. My mother taught me to make stew that could last for 3 days and to knot a rope in 3 quick moves. I left for a while to learn how to plane a board in a city shop, and then I came back because my uncle left me the property in 1979 after he died. I inherited not just land, but an obligation to keep things in order, to fix what was broken, and to mind my own business. Loss taught me to hold quietly. My sister Ellen moved to Portland and became a school teacher. My father died in 1981, and when the grief came, I buried it in work. The barn was already there, sagging in the middle, smelling of hay and old oil. I learned to find comfort in routine. Coffee at dawn, the radio set to an old station, my dog Rosie sleeping at my feet. I carried a small carved token in my pocket, a scrap of wood with a tree etched into it that my uncle had whittled for me. When I was a child, that token became the symbol of a promise, to keep safe what mattered even if no one else understood why. Those years built a life of steady hands and small truths. I never intended to become a guardian of anything more than tools, but when I dragged Hank into the barn, my life split into before and after, and my idea of right and wrong was rewritten by breath and need. The day I found him began with a sound that did not belong to the forest. I was following a stray trail of bent ferns and fresh tracks when I heard a low, pained groan that made my teeth ache. The air was damp and metallic, like the taste of pennies in your mouth after rain. I saw him half collapsed against a stone, fur matted with blood, a crude snare embedded in his forearm. His eyes were dark and patient, and full of a comprehension that made my hands go cold. He was larger than any man and more fragile than any deer I had ever lifted. I remember the way the sun hit the wet needles and made a bright noise on the leaves, the smell of crushed moss, the sour tang of old blood, the roughness of his fur against my palms when I lifted him. "Easy now," I said, though I had no idea if he knew what the words meant. He made a sound that was part cough and part thank you. The snare was a loop of wire. I had wire cutters in the toolbox on my truck. I talked to him while I worked. "Hold on, I am not going to hurt you." He watched me with a stillness that felt like accusation and relief at once. At one point, a neighbor's dog started barking from a nearby property. I froze, then moved faster, whispering, "Shh, quiet." The creature flinched at the bark, and then lay very still, as if listening for danger. When I cut the wire, blood rose slow and dark along his arm. He hissed, and I hissed back, because I had learned that small echoes can be reassuring. I wrapped a blanket I had in the truck around him and carried him like a rotting sack of mail, my back burning, my arms trembling, every step a decision. It was me and the smell of earth and the distant hum of a faraway highway. At one clearing, I thought of calling the ranger. At another, I thought of the news and men with clipboards. At last, I struck a choice. I would not call. I could not imagine a world in which he would not be caged or dissected for curiosity. I brought him home. I led him into the barn, closed the door, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to break the rules. The first days were improvisation and hush. I cleaned his wound the way I could, using boiled water and old towels, the smell of antiseptic and coffee hanging in the air. He flinched when I touched the raw skin, and I talked to him like a man who had lost his brother. "This will hurt," I told him, "but it will get better." He blinked slowly and made a series of low noises, and I learned those sounds as if learning a new chord. I set up a bed of straw and blankets, and I discovered that he loved the taste of mashed potatoes and the smell of hot broth. He would close his eyes and breathe steam like fog tracking across a window. Communication at first was gestures and mimicry. When I tilted my head, he leaned his. When I offered my palm, he touched it with a rough, calloused hand and squeezed once, a pressure that meant trust. I did dozens of small things to assess him. I ran my thumb along his knuckles. I tested his reaction to music by turning on an old radio. I watched his pupils in changing light. At night, I kept the lamp dim and the barn warm with extra straw. He smelled like wet wood and soil and something older beneath both. I translated his coughs into needs and his silences into gratitude. After 3 nights, I realized I needed help, but help from whom? Who would understand? I called Tommy Bates, who had been my best friend since high school, because he owed me a favor and because he was the kind of man who could keep a secret. When Tommy arrived, he stood at the barn door, took in the sight, and then simply sat down and put his head in his hands. We exchanged practical orders and quiet arguments until the routine settled. The creature watched us like a judge and like a child. Our dialogue over those first days was short and frequent, and I can still replay 8 different lines in my head. We cannot take him to a vet. What if he dies? Then we bury him. How will we feed him? Potatoes, sometimes canned meat. Will he hurt someone? Not if we keep him calm. Do you think the government will come? Then we will not be here to answer their questions. He looks at you like he knows you. Maybe he does. That was the rhythm. Fear, care, barter, tenderness. As the months lengthened into years, a routine grew that made secrecy feel possible. I built modifications to the barn. A narrow inner room lined with straw. A tunnel dug to the root cellar so he could be moved when storms hit. A false loft to hide signs of movement from curious eyes. I learned to repair his nails with simple filings and to fashion splints from spare wood. I taught him, as best I could, to come when I called. I taught him to accept the token, that small wood carving I kept in my pocket as a sign of safety. He would tap the token when he was calm, and I would tap back. We shared small rituals, an evening cup of warm broth, a radio playing classical music low, my reading aloud from old newspapers so his ears could follow human cadence. He learned habits. He liked to sit by the window at noon and press his palm to the glass, watching light slide across the field. He would hum when he was content, a low thrum that made the beams of the barn tremble. We had close calls. Once the roof caught from a stray spark from a lantern. The smell of smoke and the heat of flames made my heart climb into my throat. I pulled him through the smoke, coughing, and we both sat in the yard while embers fell on the grass and neighbors across the lane watched water trickle from buckets. Another time, a state biologist named Anita Cooper showed up asking about unusual reports of tracks. I met her with a calm face and a lie about heavy machinery. Later, when a young man hunting coyotes left flyers with a crude drawing near the post office, I tore them down at night while the town slept. The routine required constant invention. I planted new hedges to hide footprints. I learned to cover scents with coffee grounds. I salted paths to change the impression of weight. Over the decades, I taught him to avoid roads, to sleep during the day when tractors passed, to stay quiet when the highway sirens screamed by at night. We made friends in small ways. Rosie the dog learned to lie at his feet and to whine when he left. My neighbor Rosa Alvarez would drop milk at my step and say, "For the barn animal," as if the world did not need more. I named others who touched that life. Tommy Bates, who helped with heavy work. Dr. Emily Hayes, the discreet veterinarian who once stitched a laceration under a promise of silence. Sheriff Mark Daniels, who looked the other way more times than I can count. Luis Ortega, the local reporter who later tried to piece things together as rumor. Congressman Robert Ellis, who became involved after the reveal, and Martha Green, the elder in town, who brought soup and prayer and asked no questions. Those names are memory and ledger. Those years were full of sensory detail. The roughness of his hand, the oily tang of the animals I butchered for food, the heavy, damp smell of autumn in the barn, the creak of the old ladder, the bright cold of winter mornings when his breath smoked in the straw. Throughout our life together, moments of real, white-hot tension were never far. The first time federal agents came close happened in 1997 when someone reported an unusual radio transmission picked up in the area. I remember the moment like a blade. They arrived at dusk, the headlights shining cold through the barn slats. I felt the gravity of decades press me into a small shape, a man with a secret and a creature who trusted him. There were two agents who knocked, plain clothes, polite questions. I adapted a script we had practiced, the old man and the handyman story. The exchange elongated into 1,000 small breaths. "We are looking for unusual wildlife," one said. "Have you seen anything?" I smiled and offered them coffee. "No," I said, "just foxes." They leaned on platitudes. They asked about tracks. I pointed to deer paths and spoke of coyotes. The tension rose when a high-tech team rolled into the county a month later. They set up scanners at the edge of the woods. The night they camped 2 fields over, my stomach knotted, and I spent hours listening to the wind and the low frequencies through an old radio. Those nights are etched into me in 50 different images. The taste of cold coffee at midnight, the scrape of a boot across gravel, the metallic ping of metal detectors. I had 3 major tension episodes that I can still describe in full. The first lasted through a long waiting night when the agents returned with a tracker and a dog, and the sound of their radios carried like thunder. I kept Hank in the inner room and fed him from my hands while the dog circled the outside fence barking. The second was when a childhood friend, who I had trusted, drunkenly threatened to tell people after an argument about money. He woke me at 2 in the morning and said he had to get it off his chest. I remember the words like a slap and the way the cold sweat soaked my shirt. The third was the day the barn door was left ajar after a storm, and a neighbor almost saw a large hand pressing against the frame as Hank peered out at twilight. Each of these moments stretched me thin. Each time I chose to protect him, I felt like a conspirator and a caretaker at once. The decisions cost sleep and peace and sometimes friendships. As the years advanced and Hank grew older, I was forced to confront questions that no man wants to face. He had scars that would not fade and joints that creaked like old doors. I started keeping detailed notes and photographs in a locked tin box. A series of Polaroids showing the curve of his jaw, the pattern of hair at his collar, a careful sample of a molar I once retrieved from a fallen nest. I kept a journal of his habits and of my own choices. Dr. Emily Hayes came to see him in secret in 2006 and performed a discreet series of non-invasive tests. She took a small sample of tissue under anesthesia and promised to analyze it alone and to send me only the findings. In her calm, almost clinical way, she told me what I feared and what I hoped. His genetic markers were unlike anything in the local database, but bore faint echoes of primate ancestry. She advised that we preserve samples and document everything in case the world ever had to know for the right reasons. We made a plan that balanced protection and documentation. I remember signing on a napkin in her kitchen under the lamplight, promising to keep him safe, and she promising to keep my secret. But secrets are porous. In 2018, a drone operator named Luis Ortega, who liked to fly over the ridge looking for deer to photograph, captured a long shadow moving at the edge of a clearing. He sent the clip to his cousin, who posted it online, and at once the ripple that had been contained became a wave. The cameras came, then the scientists, then the federal teams. The community divided. Some, like Martha Green and Rosa Alvarez, wanted to shield him as if he were kin. Others, like a group of younger journalists, wanted images and exposure. Congressman Robert Ellis demanded oversight. The balance I had kept for decades tilted. I had to make legal and ethical choices I had never imagined making. Dr. Hayes advised caution and offered to secure more tissue for study under certain guarantees. Tommy Bates agreed to help with the physical work of moving and concealing documents. Sheriff Mark Daniels stood with me in small, decisive acts that kept the initial federal sweep from finding Hank upstairs in the barn. The end came slow and tender. In early spring of 2024, Hank failed to rise one morning. His breath was shallower, his eyes clouded with a depth of tired I had never seen. I sat with him for days, holding his huge hand in mine, sipping broth together as the world outside awoke to rumors and to questions. The federal presence grew heavier, with vans and men who mapped routes and interviewed people. I had finally decided it was time to stop running. Hank's decline was a series of careful observations: less appetite, a limp that deepened, a change in vocalization where his hums became a low moan. I read aloud our old newspapers to him, and he twitched when he heard certain names. In his last hours, he reached for the token I kept in my pocket and tapped it against his palm with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt like blessing. He looked at me as if to settle accounts, and then, with a breath that sounded like a door closing in a long house, he slept. I held him as he left. We documented everything afterward. I worked with Dr. Hayes and with a specialist from a university under strict conditions to preserve tissue and to compile an archive. We created a set of documents and images, a sequence of verified laboratory results and field notes, sealed and time-stamped and sent to institutions under embargo. My confession came after. We prepared a responsible release. We called the press and arranged for an initial disclosure that prioritized dignity and scientific review. The first day the story broke, the federal reaction was stunned silence, then an avalanche of statements, then an immediate rush to assert jurisdiction. Agents came to my doorstep. They were clinical and surprised in equal parts. They treated the evidence with the respect of scientists and the suspicion of enforcers. Some of them cried when they saw the photographs. Others spoke of protocols and chains of custody. The public reaction ranged wildly. I received messages of support from people who called me a hero and from those who called me a criminal. Senator letters arrived, a petition circulated, and the debate roared across networks. I named the people who played roles in those days because they deserve recognition. Dr. Anita Coper, who offered early advice and later testified for controlled study. Sheriff Mark Daniels, who maintained discretion. Luis Ortega, who provided footage that forced the conversation into the open. Dr. Emily Hayes, who risked reputation to save life. Tommy Bates, who never left my side. Rosa Alvarez and Martha Green, who brought food, and Congressman Robert Ellis, who insisted on federal oversight. Their reactions were human and messy. Some wanted immediate legal action. Others wanted protection and sanctuary for any others that might exist. The feds set up a review panel. Scientists asked for time and for ethical frameworks. The most shocking part was not the aggression, but the humility that followed. After the initial scramble, the first formal statement we received recognized a need to consider new laws on protection and dignity for unknown species, and that official language surprised me with its quiet care. The weeks after the reveal turned into months of testimony and debate. I testified before an ad hoc committee, my voice steady though my hands shook, and I read aloud passages from my journal. I made public the photographs and the data only after securing promises of preservation and peer review. There were protests outside my home, both for and against what I had done. People I had known for years asked hard questions. The media cycles fed on outrage and tenderness alike. Some scientists criticized my choices, saying the specimen should have been immediately turned over. Others defended the need for humane treatment and argued that my actions prevented exploitation. Laws were drafted and rewritten, and in one surprising moment, a narrow legislative act was proposed that would create protections for undocumented large mammals and assign responsibilities for government response that prioritized welfare. It was small and imperfect, but it was something. Hank's remains were treated with a ceremony that I insisted be simple. Wrapped in blankets, walked to a shaded grove he had always liked, and covered with earth by a handful of people who had been his friends in quiet ways. We left a carved wooden token on his chest and a ledger of our notes in a weatherproof box nearby. In the midst of all this, I asked viewers of the first disclosure to weigh in. If you had been in my boots that night in 1984, what would you have done? Would you protect or would you reveal? I asked people to answer simply, to type, "I would protect" or "I would reveal," and one line on why. The responses were immediate and visceral. Some wrote to say they would protect out of compassion. Others wrote that transparency and science must come first. Many asked for more detail about the tests. A few accused me of playing God. Those comments became a map of collective conscience. They shaped what we did next, because policy follows not just facts, but public sentiment. Your words mattered then, and they matter now. Now, with some distance, I reflect on choices that sustained a life out of sight. I kept a secret because I believe that dignity matters more than fame, and that some lives deserve shelter, not spectacle. I worried about exploitation and about the strange hunger of the market for the unknown. I wrestled with guilt for the times my fear kept him hidden from help that could have eased pain, and with gratitude for the years we had that would never have happened had I turned him in the day I found him. The documents we released now seed research, sparking a cautious and respectful scientific path. There are proposals for sanctuaries and for legal frameworks that ask how to deal ethically with beings that challenge our categories. The town of Cedar Hollow has been transformed in public imagination and in policy discussions. People who once passed me without a nod now stop to ask how I am, or to offer a memory they had of a shadow in the trees. Some have apologized for suspicion. Some will never forgive me. That is the cost of the choices we make when we place a life above convenience. When I think of Hank, I think of that small carved token that started as a toy and became a covenant. I keep another token now on my mantle, the same carved tree my uncle whittled, aged and smoothed by 40 years of pocketing. I am older and quieter. I have no illusions about the world. I do believe, however, that how we treat the unexpected says more about us than any scientific discovery. There are lessons here about humility and about responsibility. If there are others like Hank, my hope is that they are met with protection and not spectacle, with study but not cruelty, with laws that insist on dignity. If this story touched you, please subscribe to follow the next chapters of what we are learning and to hear other accounts of difficult choices. These stories do not end with a single revelation. They continue in how communities choose to protect the vulnerable, and in how scientists and citizens build frameworks that balance knowledge with compassion. I will close with the simple truth that guided me through 40 years. Some friendships are worth any secret.